Okay, so this week's Parsha is Parshios Chukas, begins on page 839. So page
We have
839
two.
in the Parsha Sitter.
Do we have two parshas?
Yes,
Can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so we have two Parshios this week. It's Chukas and Balak, and it's an interesting combination that doesn't happen in Israel. It's only outside of Israel that the way we have the two of those together. We have Chukas and Balak together, and that's because the reason why it's this year is because the second day of Shavuos came out on Shabbos. So in Israel, there's only one day of Shavuos. So the second day was they read the Shabbos reading. Because outside of Israel, the second day of Shavuos is Yantif, so we read the Shavuos reading, and because of that, we're a parsha behind. So we've been a parsha behind Israel for the past few weeks since Shavuos. We've been a parsha behind, and just now we're catching up. I've been doing these two together, and that's why I don't know. Yeah, it's a very, very legitimate question, and I don't know. That's true, but that's not such a parallel. Yeah, yeah, maybe, but yeah, I don't know why we do these together. Where was I going with that? Like you would think that like Balak and Pinchas would naturally flow into each other, or maybe something even earlier, but for some reason it's Chukas and Balak. Yeah, you're right. Okay. Yes, you did. Okay, so with that introduction, oh yeah, so and just to just bring out how unusual this is that Zev Weinberg's bar mitzvah was in Israel the week after Shavuos. So he was preparing Parshas Naso, and like a month before, his grandfather realized that wait, in Israel they're not going to be reading Naso that week. So so they had to get together like an American minyan, a minyan of foreigners who, for them, they're reading, even though they're in Israel, they follow their custom, which is to have 2 days of Yantif, and therefore they're still behind. But yeah, it's very interesting that like you have different Torah readings in Israel and outside of Israel during these weeks. This week we're catching up by doing two. So let's see, and they're big parshas, not necessarily in size, but in content. So let's see what we do. Let's see what we could get to this week. So beginning with Chukas, in page 839 in the Art Scroll Chumash, verse where are we? Okay, yeah, 839, chapter 19. Begins Hashem spoke to Moshe and Aaron, saying, "This is the decree of the Torah which Hashem has commanded, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, they shall take to you a complete red cow, which is without blemish, and upon which a yoke has not come, and Elazar the Kohen will slaughter it outside the camp, and they burn it up whole with some other things, and then they would take those ashes, mix it in water, and they sprinkle it on someone who is impure through contact with the dead. And that's how someone who was impure through contact with the dead would purify themselves. But it's introduced as this is the decree of the Torah. The Hebrew is chukas Torah. It's a chuk. It's a decree of the Torah. And there are mitzvahs have various names given to depending on the type of mitzvah it is. A chok is the type of mitzvah that what we call a mitzvah that we don't understand the reason for. And there are various reasons why sages say this is a chok. Besides, the Rambam says that all the ideas of ritual impurity, which this is about, this is how to become purified from ritual impurity. All of that are things we don't understand. It's beyond human comprehension. But and some of our sages say that it's because anyone who was involved in the processing of the red heifer becomes impure and needs to dip in the mikveh. But at the same time, the person who sprinkled on, who started out impure, becomes pure. So there's a paradox there. Then that's what's difficult about it. And that's why it's beyond human comprehension. And our sages say that Shlomo Melech, King Solomon, said in Koheles, Ecclesiastes, Amarti achakma v'rachok mimeni, that he said that I said that I'll become wise, but it's beyond me. And our sages say that he was referring to the laws of the red heifer, the red cow, I should say, when he said that I thought I would be wise, but it's beyond me. He said, even the wisest of all men couldn't understand the red heifer. And our sages say, the Kli Yakar explains that that what this means is that he thought he was wise, that he was understanding all the mitzvahs in the Torah. Once he got to the red cow and he saw how it was beyond him, so he came to the realization that as much as he thought he understood, every mitzvah is beyond him. That if there's something that's beyond him, it's probable that there were greater meanings to all the other mitzvahs that he didn't understand. And that paraduma, he's saying every mitzvah in the Torah is a chok. Every mitzvah in the Torah is really beyond us, and we could come to some level of understanding of each mitzvah, but the true reality of what the mitzvah is about and all the depth of the meaning of each mitzvah is beyond human comprehension.
Yeah, but I guess this one just said some of them you can understand some of it.
Yes.
But this one you can understand none of it.
Well, they give reasons. Our sages say in the Gemara, even it says that like it's a chok, it's something beyond us. But the Gemara says a mashal, it gives a parable to understand it, and it says the parable was, I think, that if the maid in the palace, so you have a palace, and there's a maid in the palace, and a maid has her son there with her, and the son makes a mess. His diaper falls off or takes off his diaper and makes a mess in the palace. So who's the one who they asked to clean it up? They have to clean up. The mother of the child who made the mess gets told, you clean that up. And so they say this is a mashal, a parable for the paraduma, the red heifer, or the red cow, I should say. Once again, I keep saying heifer, but heifer has very specific meaning. Coming from the Midwest, we know these things. But my wife's from Texas also. But heifer has very specific meaning. It's a cow that hasn't given birth yet, and at a certain age. This is a red cow, and if you look at ArtScroll translates it as red cow. It never says red heifer. But that we brought the golden calf when we stood by Mount Sinai, and that brought death to the world, and when that brought impurities to the world, and this, in a sense, the mother of the calf, the red cow, is being called to clean up the mess of the baby. That when there's death, the mother cleans it up. But once again, this is a parable to tell us it's not something really readily understandable. Even if someone understood the parable, there's great depth to it that goes into the great secrets of the Torah. Okay, it continues. So what did they do with this? So we said they burned the cow and mix in other stuff, cedar wood, hyssop, and crimson thread. In verse 7, the Kohen shall immerse his clothing, immerse himself in water, and afterwards he may enter the camp, and the Kohen shall remain contaminated until evening. Like we said, everyone who's involved in the processing, it becomes impure. The one who burns it shall immerse his clothing, immerse himself in water, shall remain contaminated until evening. He has to dip himself in his clothing in the mikvah. A pure man shall gather the ash of the cow, place it outside the camp in a pure place. And in verse 10, the one who gathers the ash of the cow shall immerse his clothing, etc. And this is an eternal decree. So now what did they use this for? So on page 841, verse 11, whoever touches the corpse of any human being shall be contaminated for 7 days. He shall purify himself with it on the 3rd day and the 7th day. That means they mix some of the ashes with water and sprinkle it on him, on this impure person, on the 3rd day of counting after he became impure through contact with the dead, and on the 7th day, then he will become pure. And in verse 13, whoever touches the dead body of a human being who will have died and did not purify himself, if he shall have contaminated the tabernacle of Hashem, that person shall be cut off from Israel, meaning a person has to be ritually pure when he enters the tabernacle. And it continues in verse 14. So that's if someone comes in direct contact with a dead body. In verse 14, this is the teaching regarding a man who would die in a tent. Anything that enters the tent and anything that is in the tent shall be contaminated for 7 days. Any open vessel that has no cover fastened to it is contaminated. On the open field, anyone who touches one slain by the sword or that died, or a human bone or a grave, should be contaminated for 7 days. So basically anyone who comes in contact with a dead body, or in verse 14, anyone who's in the same tent as a dead body, that means under the same roof as a dead body, becomes contaminated, becomes ritually impure, as if they actually touched the dead body. And this is the reason why a Kohen, so like nowadays we don't really the laws of ritual impurity are not very relevant to us because the prohibitions because basically we can't do the red cow because it's not available to us. So everyone pretty much has come in some contact with the dead in one of these ways. So we're all ritually impure. But this is very relevant to Kohen. Because even though it's probable that a Kohen is also impure through contact with the dead, whether he was by a close relative's funeral, which he's allowed to go to, like a father, a mother, a brother, or he's or he had been in a place where someone died in Italy, Richard. So, but it is very relevant because a Kohen is prohibited from bringing himself into a situation where he becomes ritually impure through contact. So a Kohen, that's why a Kohen is not allowed to enter a cemetery unless it's one of those exceptional close relatives. And I remember when I was in yeshiva in Lakewood, so occasionally they would do a funeral service inside the yeshiva. So here we usually do it graveside. Many places they do the actual funeral. Yeah. Many places they do the actual funeral in a chapel, and like for the great rabbis they would do it in the yeshiva beis medrash. And when they would do that, they would just put up signs before and announcements. Every Kohen has to leave the building. And because we said that if they're under the same roof, so they don't just have to like not come in contact with the coffin. They have to be outside of the room, and even outside the room if the door's open. So they're still under the same. It's considered they're still under the same roof. So there's one door really in the yeshiva that separated two buildings that were just like attached by a door. There was a door to get in between the two, and that door, when there was a funeral, in one side they would completely seal that door with like duct tape, just so nobody could open it. They would lock it and seal it with tape and seal up any gaps. And then a Kohen would be allowed to be in the other side.
Hospital.
Yeah.
Wherever they're at, Jersey, did an announcement, somebody has just passed away.
All Kohen live. Yep.
He took off. I was wondering about.
Yeah, hospitals are right. A Kohen would probably this tumas this impurity through that spreads under being under the same roof is only if it's a Jew who died. That a non-Jewish that doesn't have that same impurity that that causes impurity to everything under the same roof. So but in a hospital in an area where there are lots of Jews, a Kohen would only be able to go to the hospital if it was for a compelling reason. Meaning if let's say the Kohen has a young child who's sick, it's not just they have an obligation to go to, because a young child who's sick is considered in danger. But a Kohen, let's say, couldn't just go to visit somebody in the hospital if it's likely there may be some Jews who had passed away there. So it's just another thing Kohanim have to keep in mind.
No, a Kohen worked for Habitat. Deal on
Right.
Eisenhower. And
For the hospice, right? Yeah. I was by a funeral of a Kohen a Kohen's wife had passed away, and one of the things he said he gave a eulogy. He said like this: "I don't belong here," saying he has a mitzvah to be there for his wife. For a wife's funeral, that's one of the exceptions. But he was saying like, "This is not where I belong," and it's he said, "But this is my mitzvah to be here for this specific funeral." Okay. Okay, so it gives the procedure in verse 18. A pure man shall take hyssop and dip it in the water that has the ashes mixed in and sprinkle upon the tent, upon the vessels, upon the people who were there, upon the one who touched the bone, the slain one, the one that died in the grave. And once again, he does this on the third day and the seventh day. And then he shall immerse his clothing. Immerse himself in water on the seventh day and become purified in the evening. Okay. So now, so after that, on page 843, chapter 20, In verse 1, the children of Israel, the whole assembly, arrived in the wilderness of Sin in the first month, and the people settled in Kadesh, and Miriam died there, and she was buried there. So Rashi comments on here where it says the children of Israel, the whole assembly. What does that mean, the whole assembly, as opposed to just the children of Israel? So Rashi comments that it's a quote from Medrash Tanchuma, is that the whole assembly means that all the people who were meant to enter the land of Israel, meaning all the people who were cursed in a sense who were to be punished that they weren't going to enter the land after the sin of the spies, that the people accepted the message of the spies, and that whole generation was to die out before they entered the land. That had happened already, and now all the people who are alive were the ones who were not subject to that decree, which means that last week we had Korach, Parshios Korach, which happened immediately after the sin of the spies, according to the Ramban at least. So it immediately followed the sin of the spies. So we had Korach, and now in this short, between the beginning of Chukas and here, it's been about 38 years. And that's I think pretty amazing that we have everything that happened before their time in the desert was covered before the spies. The spies, Korach, was immediately after that. And now we have the mitzvah of impurity through contact with the dead, and immediately we skip 38 years to the end of their time in the desert. And I think Rav Shimon Schwab comments on that what were they busy doing then? Primarily, they were traveling, but they also, that whole generation died out, so they're burying the dead, and they were impure through the contact with the dead. Okay, another thing I say is that this was that the golden, I'm sorry, not the golden calf, but the red cow was put close by to the death of Miriam, that they were juxtaposed to tell us that just like just like the red heifer purifies from impurity, the death of the righteous also cleanse from spiritual impurity. And here the death, so it's immediately before the death of Miriam, it talks about how about the red heifer or the red cow. Okay, so what happens? So Miriam dies, and in verse 2, there was no water for the assembly. And I say this is because the well, it's called the well of Miriam, the well that gave them water throughout their time in the desert, was in the merit of Miriam. When she died, so they had no water. So there's no water. They gathered against Moshe and Aaron. The people quarreled with Moshe and spoke up, saying, "If only we had perished as our brethren perished before Hashem. Why have you brought the congregation of Hashem to the wilderness to die there, we and our animals? Why did you bring us up from Egypt to bring us to this evil place, not a place of seed or fig or grape or pomegranate, and there's no water to drink?" Moshe and Aaron went from the presence of the congregation to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. The glory of Hashem appeared to them. And Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, "Take the staff and gather together the assembly, you and Aaron your brother, and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it shall give water. It shall bring forth for them water from the rock, and give drink to the assembly and to their animals." Moshe, on page 845, Moshe took the staff from before Hashem as he had commanded him. Moshe and Aaron gathered the congregation before the rock and said to them, "Listen now, O rebels, shall we bring forth water for you from this rock?" Then Moshe assembled his arm and struck the rock with his staff twice. Abundant water came forth, and the assembly and the animals drank. Sounds great. But it continues in verse 12. Hashem said to Moshe and Aaron, "Because you did not believe in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you will not bring this congregation to the land that I've given them. There the waters of strife where the children of Israel contended with Hashem, and they were sanctified through them." So the commentaries, each commentary really has their own approach to what it was that Moshe and Aaron did wrong here. Everything sounds great. What did they do wrong?
They didn't do what they were told.
Right. So the question is, what was it that they did that they weren't told? So Rashi says, like Fred was saying, is that they were told to speak to the rock, but instead they hit the rock. The Ramban disagrees very strongly with that. And the Ramban says, Hashem told Moshe, "Take your staff with you when you hit the rock." I mean, when you speak to the rock. Understood was, why are you taking your staff? To hit the rock, which he was commanded earlier when they originally got the well of Miriam. So then he was explicitly commanded to hit the rock, and that was understood, that he was taking the staff to hit it as well. The Ramban quotes the Rabbeinu Hananel we have two Parshios today, so I'm not going to go too much into this, but he quotes the Ramban quotes Rabbeinu Hananel, who he's not very happy with, but he's okay with, that he says that the problem was that Moshe and Aaron said, shall we bring forth water for you from this rock? Instead of saying, shall Hashem bring forth water from this rock, they implied that they were doing it themselves. And that implication was what was wrong, is that they didn't sanctify the name of Hashem by stating God is going to bring water from this rock, and that instead they said, we're going to bring water from this rock. And
No, they said, and we bring you water from
they were at what they were they pretty much understood this was a rhetorical question, that he was saying, could we bring water from this rock? And they did. Like, it was basically like, look and see this great thing that we're going to do. It's like a magician says, like, there's nothing in here, right? And then like, could I pull a rabbit out of this hat? And then like, out comes the rabbit. But they said, could we bring water out of this rock? And then they hit the rock and water came out. So the implication of what they said was that they're doing it instead of Hashem. That's Rabbeinu Hananel's understanding. Pretty much the Ramban says that, like, if you want an answer that will answer the question, but he's not very happy. The Ramban says that it was about them hitting twice, which I think the obvious understanding would be that it says that they hit the rock twice. So if you hit the rock once, you're just doing what Hashem said, but hitting it twice implies that, like, it's a physical process, and once wasn't enough, so you have to hit it again. So, and the Ramban though says that it's from the secrets of the Torah and it's something from the Kabbalah. So that's beyond me. Okay, so anyway, it continues on page 847. After this, Moshe sent emissaries from Kadesh to the king of Edom. And he said, so said your brother Israel, you know all the hardship that has befallen us. Our forefathers descended to Egypt. We dwelled in Egypt many years. The Egyptians did evil to us, to our forefathers. We cried out to Hashem, heard our voice, sent an emissary and took us out of Egypt. Now behold, we are in Kadesh city at the end of the border. Let us pass through your land. We shall not pass through a field or vineyard. We will not drink well water. On the king's road shall we travel, and until we pass through the border. Saying we'll pay for whatever we take. We're not going to go through the fields. We're just pass through your land on the road. We're not going to bother you at all. And Edom said to him, you shall not pass through me, lest I come against you with the sword. And again, the children of Israel said, we'll just go on the highway. We'll just travel through the road, and we'll pay for everything we take. We'll pay you off. And Edom came out with a big army, and Israel turned away from near him, and they went all the way around the land of Edom. Okay, so the commentaries ask on this whole conversation that why is Moshe like giving the whole history lesson to the king of Edom, that we were in Egypt and the Egyptians did evil to us, we were slaves, and Hashem set us free? Why is that relevant to their request? Their request is, can we please travel through your land? And we won't bother you, and we'll even support your economy. So the commentaries say is that, remember, Edom is a descendant of Esau. And that's the reason why he went around and they didn't attack, like we'll see later they did to the Amorites, was because we were commanded not to bother Edom, because he is our brother, and Esau, their ancestor, honored his father Yitzchak. So we're commanded not to bother them. So, but Esau really viewed Yaakov in a negative light. From his perspective, Yaakov stole the firstborn birthright from him. And now, what are we doing? We're on our way, headed to the land of Canaan, to inherit the land that was promised to Avram, to Yitzchak, and in Esau's view, and then to Esau. So Edom's perspective would be, you're going to take our land. So what Moshe was telling the king of Edom was that part of the promise of getting the land of Canaan was that they'll be slaves in a land that's not theirs, and they'll suffer first. And Moshe was saying to the king of Edom, we went through all the suffering. We paid the price. We paid the price in suffering, so it's really our land. You don't want that suffering to acquire the land. Okay, but anyway, they went around. And verse 22, they journeyed from Kadesh, and the children of Israel arrived in entire assembly again at Mount Hor. And then Aaron died. So Aaron died. It says in verse 25, at the bottom of 847, Take Aaron and Eleazar his son, bring them out Mount Hor, strip Aaron of his vestments, of the sacred vestments of the Kohen Gadol, and dress Eleazar his son in them, and Aaron shall be gathered in and die there. And Moshe did as Hashem commanded. They ascended Mount Hor before the eyes of the entire assembly. Moshe stripped Aaron's garments from him and dressed Eleazar his son in them, that Aaron got to see his son fill his place and become the Kohen Gadol. Then Aaron died there on top of the mountain, and Moshe and Eleazar descended from the mountain. When the entire assembly saw that Aaron had perished, they wept for Aaron 30 days, the entire house of Israel. So it stresses that the entire house of Israel wept for Aaron. And our sages say this is because Aaron was, our sage, the Mishnah in Parshios, it says that he should be from the students of Aaron, that he was an Ohev Shalom v'Rodev Shalom, that he was a lover of peace and a pursuer of peace. Is that he excelled in making peace between parties that were in conflict. And for this reason, he was beloved by everybody. Okay, so now in chapter 21 on page 849, the Canaanite king of Arad, who dwelled in the south, heard that Israel had come by the route of the spies, and he warred against Israel and took a captive from it. Israel made a vow to Hashem and said, if you deliver this people into my hand, I will consecrate their cities. Hashem heard the voice of Israel, delivered the Canaanite, and consecrated them in their cities. They named the place Hormah. Okay. So our sages say that these weren't Canaanites; they were actually Amalekites, because when the spies came in, it says Amalek was in the south. So that it was actually Amalek, but the Amalekim dressed up as Canaanites. They dressed in the Canaanite garb to confuse the Jewish people. So when they would pray that save us from these Canaanites, when in fact they're Amalekites. And their prayer would be inaccurate. But if you look at the vow they said, if you deliver this people into this people, they didn't mention the name, so their prayer was accurate, and so that worked. Okay, so now in verse 4, they journeyed from Mount Hor by way of the sea reeds to go around the land of Edom, and the spirit of the people grew weary on the way. So why did they grow weary on the way? So the Balaturim says that as they're passing by the land of Edom, so they saw they saw through divine inspiration everything that would happen to their descendants at the hands of the Edomites, which is Esau, which is Europe, Western civilization, and they became disheartened by that. But the commentaries mostly say that as they were circling, they went out of the way around Esau. They remembered this happened early in their history, and that was when we first left Egypt. Hashem brought us the long way around to avoid the Philistines, to avoid immediate. So they thought we did that, and then we were stuck in the desert for 40 years. Now we're taking another detour. Perhaps we'll be stuck again for 40 years. Okay, the people spoke against Hashem and against Moshe. Why did you bring us up to Egypt to die in this wilderness where there's no food and no water? And our soul is disgusted with the insubstantial food. What's wrong with the man, the insubstantial food? So our sages say that the man was such perfect food. It was like a perfect nutrition with absolutely no waste. And they never had to relieve themselves in the desert because the man was perfectly absorbed by their body. It was like it was like an IV in their veins with absolutely no waste. And for this reason, they were saying like this can't continue, and at some point, it's come back to bite us. Okay, so in verse 6, Hashem sent the fiery serpents against the people, and they bit some people, and they came to Moshe to pray to Hashem. And in verse 8, Hashem said to Moshe, make yourself a fiery serpent, place it on a pole, be that anyone who's bitten will look at it and live. And that's what Moshe did. He made a serpent of copper, placed it on a pole, and everyone who stared at it lived. So the Ramban says, what's the meaning of this? Of the serpent? So the Ramban says that usually people say the opposite, that if somebody gets hurt by something, so the safe thing to do is not think about that thing that hurt them. That it causes more anxiety, more pain, and less likely to recover. If a person gets bitten by a dog, you don't start parading that dog in front of them while they're, like you keep that thing far away so it's not on their mind. So they get bitten by a snake. Usually you want to keep snakes away from being in front of that person. And this was done, and the real reason, and the Mishnah really says this, is that so when they looked up to the snake, it was on a pole, they look up and see the sky and the heavens and think about Hashem, and that's what brings them the healing. And they did it, and they focused on the snake in order to show that this was miraculous. It wasn't like this ritual was what was healing them. Okay, then they journeyed and camped in Ovos, and then they passed Moab. Let's read this. In verse 12, from there they journeyed and encamped in the valley of Zered. In Hebrew, that is, Zared. From there they journeyed and encamped on the other side of Arnon, which is in the wilderness that juts out from the border of the Amorite, for Arnon is in the border of Moab, between Moab and the Amorite. Therefore it is said in the book of the wars of Hashem. Now there's a poem here that's the end of this whole the Parsha. There are a few poems that are very cryptic, but the gift of the sea of reeds and the rivers of Arnon, the outpouring of the rivers when it veered to dwell at Ar and leaned against the borders of Moab. And from there to the well, that is the well of which Hashem said to Moshe, assemble the people and I shall give them water. On page 853. Then Israel sang the song, come up a well, call out to it, well that the princes dug, that the nobles of the people excavated, through a lawgiver with their staffs, a gift from the wilderness. The gift went to the valley to the heights, and from the heights to the valley in the fields of Moab, at the top of the peak overlooking the surface of the wilderness. And this is the Shiras HaBe'er, the song of the well, the song of praise to Hashem about the well. So what triggered this song? So our sages say that this border between Moab and the Amorite, and the gift of the sea of reeds, and so what's this referring to? I say that there were two mountains that the Jews had to pass between to get to where they were going. That their journey took them in between two mountains. It was like a canyon, and on each side of the canyon, the Amorites were waiting to ambush them. And there were caves on one side, and there were it jutted out on the other side, and Hashem caused the canyon to close, and like the two mountains to come together, and the Amorites were smushed in between. But the Israelites didn't know this. They didn't see this happen. They didn't know that the miracle that Hashem did. So Hashem caused the river to carry the blood and the bodies of these Amorites, or they caused the blood of the flowing into the river, and it mixed with the waters from the well, from the well of Miriam, the waters coming from the rock. And that triggered this song of thanks to Hashem, and that's what they're talking about. But the Gemara says in this song that it says, where am I? A gift from the wilderness is in verse 18. A gift from the wilderness, the gift went to the valley, then the valley to the heights, and from the heights to the valley in the field of Moab, to the top of the peak overlooking the surface of the wilderness. So our sages say, the Gemara says that this is a mashal really for a parable for what the Torah does to us. That it begins a gift from the wilderness. That the gift is the Torah that we received in the wilderness of Sinai. And it's telling us that the Torah is given to us in the wilderness, meaning that if a person makes themselves like the wilderness, where the wilderness is something that anyone could go, it's hefker, it's ownerless. So if a person makes themselves available to anybody to share their Torah knowledge with them, so then they're given the gift of the Torah. And then it said the gift went to the valley, and from the valley, the gift went to the valley, that they'll acquire the Torah, and then they should be humble. And from the valley to the heights. And he's saying that Hashem will raise them up from the valley to the heights, meaning will put them in positions of greatness. And from the heights to the valley in the field of Moab, that if a person raises themselves up, meaning that they chase after greatness instead of it being given to them, if a person pursues honor, so in positions of authority, so then at the top of the peak, to the valley in the fields of Moab, that they'll be brought down to the valley, that Hashem will push them down, that Hashem will give them greatness. But if they pursue greatness on their own, they pursue honor on their own, so Hashem will push them down into the valley. And at the top of the peak, overlooking the surface of the wilderness, they'll go from the peak all the way down to the surface, all the way down, they'll come crashing down to the ground. Okay, so then in verse 21, Israel sent emissaries to Sichon, the king of the Amorites, and Sichon did not allow them to pass through. And they came out against them, and they destroyed Sichon. And then there's another poem here on page 855, verse 25. Israel took all these cities, and Israel settled in the Amorite cities in Cheshbon, all suburbs. For Cheshbon, it was the city of Sichon, king of the Amorite, and he had warred against the first king of Moab, and took all his land from his control until Arnon. On page 855, verse 27, regarding this, the poets would say, come to Cheshbon, let it be built and established as the city of Sichon. For fire has come forth from Cheshbon, a flame from the city of Sichon. Again, a poem. Consumed Ar of Moab, the masters of Arnon's heights. Woe to you, O Moab, you have lost, O people of Chemosh. He made his sons fugitives and his daughters captives of the king of the Amorite Sichon. The sovereignty over Cheshbon was lost. It was removed from Divon. We laid waste to Nophach, which reached up to Medeba. To Medva. Okay, so what's this all about? So the Ramban says that there's a problem here, and that it's a problem that it might cause problem to the Jews later, and that is that we were commanded, besides not bothering Esau, which we spoke out earlier, we were commanded not to bother Moab. Ammon and Moab were descendants of Lot, were sons of Lot. We were commanded not to disturb them. So how did we go? So later generations would say, hey, you guys are living in Moab's territory, and you were commanded not to bother Moab. So for this reason, the Torah records that this part of Moab was actually conquered by a different nation. It was conquered by the Amorites earlier, and for that reason, we were able to take it from the Amori. And in the song that's written in the what does it call it? The poets, this quote from the poets was gives a lot of the cities, a lot of the areas, really the boundaries that that were conquered by the Amori, to tell them that this wasn't Ammon land when we got there. Okay, so we settled by the Amori, and then another Amorite warlord came. That was Og, the king of Bashan. And Hashem said to Moshe, do not fear him, for in your hand I will give him and his entire people and his land. You shall do to him as you did to Sichon, king of the Amorite, who dwells in Cheshbon. They smote him, his sons, and all his people until there was no survivor left of him, and they took possession of his land. And now the children of Israel journeyed and encamped in the plains of Moab on the banks of the Jordan, opposite Jericho, opposite Jericho. We're just about ready to go into the land. We're right across the Jordan River from the land of Israel. And Jericho was the first place that we captured once we got there. But there's still more to go. So this week, we also read Balak, and we'll talk about it briefly. Okay. For another Parsha. So on page 857, Balak, son of Tzipor, saw that Israel had done to him the Amorite. Moab became very frightened of the people because it was numerous, and Moab was disgusted in the face of the children of Israel. Moab said to the elders of Midian, now the congregation will look up our entire surroundings as an ox looks up the greenery of the field. Balak, son of Tzipor, was king of Moab at that time. So remember, I just said that we were commanded not to attack Moab. So Moab really didn't have anything to fear from us. And I say that's why it says, I saw in the commentaries, that the congregation will lick up our entire surrounding as an ox looks up the greenery of the field, meaning that they won't attack us, but we'll get involved in the skirmishes because they're going to be attacking on the borders, just like when a cow is just eating in the field, it might look up, doesn't exactly aim perfectly, and we'll get caught up in all the battles. So in verse 5, he sent messengers to Bilam, son of Baor, to Pesor, which is by the river of the land of the members of his people, to summon him, saying, behold, the people has come out of Egypt. Behold, it has covered the surface of the earth, and it sits opposite me. So now please come and curse this people for me, for it is too powerful for me. Perhaps I'll be able to strike it and drive it away from the land, for I know that whomever you bless is blessed, and whomever you curse is accursed. So he went to Bilam, who's he's actually a prophet of Hashem. Hashem granted prophecy to him. He was the prophet for the non-Jews. And he was also had this tremendous ability to curse. And I say this ability was he was able to always see the bad. He was able to look at something, like some people have negative perspective, and they could just hone in into a person's weaknesses and just like bring out the worst in a person. And that was Bilam. Bilam was able to see like what is this person's weaknesses, what's their spiritual weaknesses, what's bad about them. And yes, and thereby he was able to curse them. So in verse 7, the elders of Moab, the elders of Midian went with charms in their hands. They brought all their like magical equipment, and they came to Bilam and spoke to him the words of Balak. He said to them, "Spend the night here, and I shall give you a response," etc. And in verse 9 on page 859, Hashem came to Bilam and said, "Who are these men with you?" Bilam said to Hashem, "Balak, son of Tzipor, king of Moab, sent to me. Behold, the people coming out of Egypt has covered, etc." And he said, "They want me to go and curse them." Hashem said to Bilam in verse 12, "You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for it is blessed." And he told them, and they left. And then he sent higher ranking officers. And they kept on doing that. They kept on refusing, and they kept sending higher. And so they kept on asking him, and in verse 18 it says, Bilam answered and said to the servants of Balak, "If Balak will give me his household of silver and gold, I cannot transgress the word of Hashem my God to do anything great, small or great. And now you two stay here for the night, for I'll know more of what Hashem will speak with me." And now he's starting to negotiate. Notice that before he said, "I won't do it," now he's negotiating and saying, if he gives me this money, if he gives me $1 million, I won't do it. He's putting a price. 1 million I won't. What about 2 million? Maybe. So Hashem came to Bilam at night and said to him, "If the men here came to summon you, arise and go with them, but only the thing I shall speak to you, that you shall do." So Bilam arose in the morning and saddled his she-donkey and went with the officers of Moab. And Hashem's wrath flared because he was going. And we'll get into this in a second. And an angel of Hashem stood on the road to impede him. And first it verse 23, the she-donkey saw the angel of Hashem standing on the road with a sword rod in his hand. So the she-donkey turned away from the road and went into the field. Then Bilam struck the she-donkey to turn it back on the road. The angel of Hashem stood in the path of the vineyards, a fence on this side and a fence on that side. The she-donkey saw the angel of Hashem and pressed against the wall, and it pressed Bilam's leg against the wall, and he continued to strike it. The angel of Hashem went further and stood in a narrow place where there was no room to turn right or left. The she-donkey saw the angel of Hashem and crouched beneath Bilam. Bilam's anger flared, and he struck the she-donkey with the staff. He started beating it. So Hashem opened the mouth of the she-donkey and said to Bilam, "What have I done to you that you struck me these 3 times?" Bilam said to the she-donkey, "Because you mocked me. If only there was a sword in my hand, I would have killed you." Then the she-donkey said, "Am I not your she-donkey that you have ridden all your life until this day? If I'd been accustomed to do such a thing to you?" He said, "No." So he's arguing with his donkey. And I say to say that this was a miracle. This was the mouth of this donkey was prepared from on the 6th day of creation to have this conversation with Bilam. And then Hashem uncovered Bilam's eyes and saw the angel of Hashem standing on the road, and they had a conversation. And Bilam, verse 34, Bilam said to the angel of Hashem, "I have sinned, for I did not know that you were standing opposite me. And now if it is evil in your eyes, I shall return." The angel of Hashem said to Bilam, "Go with the men, but only the word that I shall speak to you, that you shall speak." So Bilam went with the officers of Balak. So now, what's going on here? At first, Hashem tells him not to go. Then Hashem tells him that if the men came to summon you, arise and go with them. Then it says, and Hashem saw Hashem's wrath flared because he was going. Why does Hashem just told him to go? Now he's angry because he's going. And then Hashem sends an angel to stop him. It stops him. And then what is the Bilam says to the angel, "Oh, if you don't want me to go, I'll go right back." And the angel says, "No, go with them." What's going on? So Shimon Schwab explains that the real problem here, what Hashem told Bilam is, if the people are summoning you, go with them. Meaning, you could go with them. If you're doing it for the money and for the honor, you could do it. But what did Bilam do? It says in verse 21, Bilam arose in the morning, saddled his she-donkey, and went with the officers of Bilam. And Hashem's wrath flared because he was going. And then it says he was riding his she-donkey and 2 young men that were with him. What happened to the princes of Moab who were sent with him? It says 2 young men were with him. So he explains that Bilam was so excited about going to curse them that he saddled up his own donkey, woke up early in the morning, saddled up his own donkey, and ran ahead. So everyone was behind him. He just couldn't wait to get there. And that's what Hashem was angry about. Not that he went. Hashem told him he could go, but Hashem told him, you could go if you're in it for the money. You could go with them for the money and for the honor. But he was going to because he wanted to go. He was all excited about it and going ahead. And that's why Hashem stopped him. And then again, when he told the angel, if you want me to go back, I'll go back. The angel of Hashem said in verse 35, go with the men, meaning go with them. You could go with them for the money and the honor. You could go while you're being accompanied by them, but don't go for your own purposes. And the reason for this is that when someone does something lishma, for its own sake, without any of their own, without their own agenda, but purely for a selfless agenda, so that's very dangerous. That's very likely to be successful, and it would be miraculous for us to be saved from that. Whereas if he's going for the money, so then it's, if he's not successful, it's not miraculous. So that's the nature of things. Okay. So what happened? So Balak said so he got there, he brought a bunch of offerings with Balak. And where am I? So in verse 5 on page 865, Hashem put an utterance in Bilam's mouth and said, go back to Balak and thus shall you say. He returned, he proclaimed his parable and said in verse 7, from Aram, Balak, king of Moab, led me from the mountains of the east. Come curse Yaakov for me and bring anger upon Israel. How can I curse? God is not cursed. How can I anger? Hashem is not angry. For from its origins I see it rock-like, and from hills do I see, behold, it is a nation that will dwell in solitude and not be reckoned among the nations. We're separate from all the nations. And here he looked at our history and saw, as it says, that he saw, from its origins I see it rock-like. He saw that our forefathers were steadfast in their faith in Hashem, and there's no weaknesses in our origin. Who can, in verse 10, who can, in page 867, who has counted the dust of Yaakov or numbered the quarter of Israel? May my soul die the death of the upright, and may end be like his. Notice he didn't say, may I live like the upright, but he said, let me die like the upright. He wanted a righteous death without the righteous life.
Can't have it.
Exactly, you can't have that. It's funny that that is called, and our sages call that, which is really the end of this week's parsha. They call that acting like Zimri and wanted to be rewarded like Pinchas, which is from the end of this parsha. It's that their people are very not self-aware, and they could be doing the greatest sins and think of themselves that I'm so righteous, I deserve such reward. Okay, and he blessed. So Balak, in verse 11, Balak said to Bilam, what have you done to me to curse my enemy? I brought you, and behold, you have even blessed. And Bilam told him, he spoke up and said, it is not so that whatever Hashem puts in my mouth, I must take heed to speak. I told you that's what I'm going to do. So they tried a different place where he'll see other sins of the Jews and brought offerings. And again, in verse 17, he came to him, and behold, he was standing by his burnt offering, and the officers of Moab were with him there. Balak said, what did Hashem speak? He declaimed his parable and said, stand erect, O Balak, and hear, give ear to me, O son of Tzipor. Hashem is not a man that he shall be deceitful, nor a son of man that he should relent. Would he say and not do, or speak and not confirm? Behold, to bless I have received. He is blessed, and I shall not contradict it. He perceived no iniquity in Yaakov. He saw no perversity in Israel. Hashem, his God, is with him, and the friendship of the king is in him. It is God who brought them out of Egypt according to the power of his loftiness. For there is no divination in Yaakov, no sorcery in Israel. Even now it is said to Yaakov and Israel what Hashem had wrought. And behold, the people will rise like a lion cub and raise itself like a lion. It will not lie down until it consumes prey and drink the blood of the slain. Our sages say this last verse 24 is, will arise a lion cub and raise itself like a lion, that the people arise early in the morning and say the Shema, and it will not lie down until it consumes prey, meaning when they go to sleep as well, we say Shema before we go to sleep, which protects us from all danger. Yeah, and drink the blood of the slain, yes. And that means that the saying of the Shema really destroys all the negative forces around us, and it's like eating the prey and drinking their blood in total destruction. Okay, so now he tries again. They go to a different place and try it again, and In verse 1 on chapter 24 and 869, Bilam saw that it was good in Hashem's eyes to bless Israel, so he did not do it as every other time towards divinations, but he set his face towards the wilderness. Bilam raised his eyes and saw Israel dwelling according to his tribes, and the spirit of Hashem was upon him. He declaimed his parable and said, the word of Bilam, son of Bar, the word of the man with the open eye. The word of the one who hears the sayings of Hashem and sees the visions of Shakai while fallen with uncovered eyes. How goodly are your tents, O Yaakov, your dwelling places, O Israel. This is really understood in two different ways. It's referring to your tents. How good are your tents is that they saw that the tents of the Jewish people were arranged in a way that the doors and windows did not correspond to each other. So they wouldn't be able to see inside each other's houses, which allowed privacy. And that's really something that it's something that's very important in the Torah, is that we give each other privacy, to the point that the Gemara says, even when a person goes home to their own house, they should knock before they go in, because their wife or children might, they might be doing something that's private, and not for the owner of the house to see. And which is really different. That it's very interesting that cults in general, the thing is that they privacy is something that's completely not allowed, so everyone can see what everyone else is doing. And that's really something that's frowned upon by our sages, is that we're required to give other people privacy. And I've mentioned this before, to the point that there's halacha that if two people own let's say a yard between the two of them, one of them could force the other one to contribute towards building a fence. That one of them could force the other one to build a fence in partnership, because, like we said, a yard is somewhere that people do things. They don't necessarily want people peeking in their yard, and if they own it jointly with their neighbor, they could force them to build a fence so they could have their privacy. Okay. So, and he concludes in verse 9, he crouched and lay down like a lion, and like a lion cub, who could stand him up? Those who bless you are blessed, those who curse you are accursed. And Balak was angry again, and he told you, I told you that I can't bless, if Hashem doesn't curse them, I can't curse them. But he concludes, and now behold, I go to my people, on page 873, in verse 14, come and I shall advise you what this people will do to your people in the end of days. He declaimed his parable and said, the word of Bilam, son of Bar, the word of the man with the open eye, the word of one who sees the sayings of Hashem and knows with the knowledge of the Supreme One, who seems the vision of Shakai while fallen with uncovered eyes. I see him, but not now. I look at him, but it is not near. Here he had a vision of Mashiach. A star has issued from Yaakov, and a scepter bearer has arisen from Israel. He shall pierce the nobles of Moab and undermine all the children of Shais. Edom shall be a conquest, and Seir shall be the conquest of his enemies, and Israel will obtain success. One from Yaakov shall rule and destroy the remnants of the city. He saw Amalek and declaimed his parable and said, Amalek is the first among nations, but its end will be eternal destruction. He saw the Canaanite and declaimed his parable and said, strong is your dwelling, and set in the rock is your nest. This is actually the family of Yisro. It's called the Cani, and he's saying that they'll be secure. For the Canaanite if the Canaanite shall be laid to rest, till where can Assyria take your captive? That's referring to the 10 tribes. Okay, and so then they went away. And the Parsha concludes with Bilam's final plot, which was successful in hurting the Jews. And that's on page 875, chapter 25. Israel settled in Shittim, and the people began to commit harlotry with the daughters of Moab. They invited the people to the feast of their gods. The people ate, prostrated themselves to their gods. Israel became attached to Baal Pa'ar, and the wrath of Hashem flared up against Israel. That this was Bilam's idea, is that even the princes of Moab and Midian to send their daughters to seduce the Jewish people, that they sold them things and invited them in, and seduced them, and then caused them to worship their gods, their idols. In verse 4, Hashem said to Moshe, take the leaders of the people, hang them before Hashem against the sun, and the flaring wrath of Hashem will withdraw from Israel. Meaning, take the leaders of the people, take the judges, and judge the people and hang the ones who were involved in this, meaning that they should be stoned, because that's the punishment for idolatry. And the people who were punished by stoning, their bodies were hanged until evening. So he's saying you should hang the people who were involved in the idolatry. But in verse 6, behold, a man from the children of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman near to his brothers in the sight of Moshe, in the sight of the entire assembly of the children of Israel, and they were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So this was, we'll see in next week Parsha, we'll see was Zimri from the tribe, who was a leader of the tribe of Shimon, and people in Shimon were dying in a plague that was brought about by Hashem's anger at their violations. So, and they said to Zimri, "Aren't you going to do something? Our people are dying." So Zimri took this Midianite princess, Cusby, and brought her in front of Moshe and said, "Am I allowed to marry her? Am I allowed to take her?" And Moshe said, "No." And he said, "You married a Midianite woman, Zipporah," and publicly defied Moshe and brought her into his tent. And the people were crying at this chutzpah. And in verse 7, Pinchas, son of Elazar, son of Aaron the Kohen, saw, and he stood up from amid the assembly and took a spear in his hand. He followed the Israelite man into the tent and pierced them both, the Israelite man and the woman, in her stomach. And the plague was halted from upon the children of Israel. And those who died in the plague were 24,000. So 24,000 died in this plague, but the plague was stopped when Pinchas stood up and committed an act of bravery because this was an important person in the tribe of Shimon. And the people of Shimon were ready to fight for him. But Hashem prevented that. And that act of valor and of jealousy is the wrong word, but of, how did they translate this? That act of vengeance for the honor of Hashem stopped the plague and stopped people from dying. Okay, shkoyach.
The